Hello and welcome to episode 64 of Not Reserving Judgment, a podcast about the latest intrigues, triumphs, and outrages in Canadian constitutional law. I'm Josh Dehaas, counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation.
And I'm Christine Van Geyn, the CCF's litigation director. Joanna is away today. In today's episode, I'm going to tell you about my recent trip to Edmonton to talk about free speech and professional regulation.
And we'll share our bad legal takes of the week, where we take a lighthearted look at some legal opinions that didn't quite land. But first, I'm going to tell you about some allegations at the University of British Columbia's law school about how it's racist and why I think the school actually is a little bit racist, but in a very different way from what this article suggests. So I'm referring to an expose by a woman named Julie Sobowale in the Walrus magazine that honestly had me repeatedly rolling my eyes. And the headline to this out-of-touch article is, "An elite law school promised reforms, then made inclusion impossible." The article starts out with this little vignette about a woman named Sarah Gebramousse, who was the only Black faculty member at UBC when she arrived in 2017. And the subtext is that, she bravely went into this lion's den alone and she was eaten alive by this racist, mostly white administration. And the article implies that Gebramousse was the only Black faculty member because law schools are racist, obviously, but the reality that the article doesn't point out is that British Columbia's population is 1% Black, so if the faculty had 100 faculty, you would expect essentially one Black professor if you were sort of doing things on numerical terms, and UBC probably has a lot fewer than 100 faculty. And as further proof of racism, the article notes that only 4% of students enrolled in Canadian law schools are Black. But again, Black law students are not underrepresented numerically because they make up 4% of the population. So it matches. So that had me raising my eyebrows right from the top. But the story itself is even more absurd, if you ask me. So apparently, Gebramousse arrived at UBC in 2017 determined to be a, quote, activist professor who would help to reform the admissions process, in other words, to make it more favorable to Black students. And she got most of what she demanded, but not quite everything, and so she decided she had to leave UBC for Ontario. Sad for you, UBC. According to the article, in 2020 and 2021, she worked with Black law students on a report that demanded race-based data be collected, that there be anti-Black racism trainings for staff, that there be at least one Black prof on the reviewing admissions applications, and that there be a dedicated stream for Black students. And they did create the dedicated stream, which I think might be offensive to Black students who are already getting into law schools on their merit in large numbers. But anyway, they did that at UBC. They didn't commit to all of her other demands, though. Around the same time, the law school was considering hiring a professor named Brenna Bandar, who, to quote the article, uses a lens of settler colonialism to understand how Israeli property law has been used to dispossess Palestinians of their land. And the dean of the law school got some complaints about this, and she initially blocked the hiring, but relented after a group of 12 faculty members, including Gebramousse, wrote to her to complain that the decision to block this hire of a Palestinian activist was racist. And this also led to an email from the associate dean attempting to address the allegations of racism and a request by that associate dean for a meeting with Gebramousse. This all happened during the pandemic, and Gebramousse's husband has asthma, you see, and yet she bravely attended this meeting, which was held outdoors, of course. And the article suggests that at this meeting, she was pressured to, lay off the activism and maybe she wouldn't get tenure as a result. Not long after that, though, the associate dean was gone and the dean herself was replaced, this time by UBC's first ever Black dean, Guy Pindell. And Pindell initially gave into more of the demands, including hiring an associate dean for equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is a great use of resources. But Pindell, despite being Black, didn't give in to all of her demands. For example, he didn't do an equity audit that she had asked for. And when plans were formed to create a center specializing in anti-racism in the law, he sort of took over the project and, in their view, interfered. But he did go ahead with the Black Faculty Cohort Hiring Initiative, which is a trend in Canadian law schools where law schools are reserving, one or more spots per year when they hire for Black people only, eliminating 96% of the population from consideration. But this still wasn't good enough, so Gabra Muse left for Western University, where she's the Castle's chair in mining law and finance and sits on the admissions committee. So now I got to say, there's really little evidence in this article of racism, but maybe I need more anti-racism training to see it. I don't know. I've had a lot of that already, having gone through law school in the past decade. What I do see, though, is reference to reserving seats for Black professors only, in other words, a quota system, and also creating quota streams for Black applicants. And, call me old-fashioned, Christine, but I think law profs should be hired based on the quality of their research and their teaching, not their mutable characteristics. And same thing for students. They should be admitted based on their marks and their LSAT scores. And, if people don't have access to LSAT study materials, or if they need some encouragement to, see themselves in the profession, or they financially can't do it and they need some scholarship help, by all means do that. But like quotas are pretty racist, and I think everybody knows that. So that's the only real racism I see going on at UBC. And I want to talk about this because I think it's a problem that it shows how woke our law schools have become and just how weak some administrators are when they get unreasonable demands. And the problem is that this leads to people like Gabra Muse on admissions and hiring committees, where they're going to, lean towards woke students and woke professors only. And so I think that really impacts the legal profession. And we're seeing that already if you look at some of the really woke initiatives taken by law societies. So I think we need law school admins to forcefully push back against unfounded allegations of racism and to commit to meritocracy again. And if they don't do that, I think we need maybe new law schools altogether. Christine, I'm not sure if you had a chance to read this article or not, but what do you think of this general idea that law schools like UBC are racist?
I, I mean, I haven't been in law school for a long time. I don't think I could survive in the current environment in law school. I mean, you were there more recently than I was, and I just can't imagine being in an environment that's so oppressive that you're afraid to speak your mind about various social, political issues. And I really didn't have an experience when I was in law school that was like that. And I went to Osgood, as you did. It's a very diverse school in terms of not just diversity of heritage, race or religion or gender diversity. It's diverse in viewpoint as well. And it's really an important experience for students to be exposed to all kinds of different things, to have their ideas and opinions challenged, and to hear new things and meet people who are different from them. So on some level, I do understand. I do understand the desire of universities to have a diverse student body, because if you only are in an echo chamber and everyone is exactly like you're not going to grow and develop in interesting ways. But the way you achieve that is not through quotas. You can achieve it through all kinds of different ways. And you can be a person who has had a diverse life experience, but might not be, an ethnic minority. You might be a white person who grew up like JD Vance, right? Like JD Vance grew up in extremely difficult life circumstances. And I think he would have added a great deal to the Yale Law School that he attended, even though he's not an ethnic minority. Like, he would have definitely been in the minority of life experiences. So I do think it's a good idea to take into account the life experiences of people who are in the faculty, who are in the student body, and that really enhances the student experience and the learning experience, both from faculty and from your peers. But the way to achieve that is not through quotas. That's sort of my initial reaction. I'll go and read the article though, because it sounds super interesting. So the topic I want to talk today is sort of related to that. It's about diversity of thought not in law schools, but within the legal profession as a whole. So I just got back from Edmonton last night, and I've been pretty consumed with what I was doing there. So that's why I want to talk about it today. I was invited to go to Edmonton to meet with the Alberta government. The Alberta government is doing a review of professional regulators. These are the self-governing bodies that regulate professions like lawyers, doctors, accountants, nurses, psychologists. These bodies exist to protect the public from the professional misconduct of their members. So things like, the classic example would be like a lawyer stealing from their trust account, or a doctor injecting a patient with cement. That is a real case, unfortunately. I'm sorry to inform you. Accountants cooking the books, or nurses showing up to work drunk, or psychologists sexually abusing their clients. So the self-governing bodies exist to catch that type of misconduct and, where appropriate, discipline the member up to and including revoking their license. You probably shouldn't have a doctor injecting people with cement. You shouldn't have a psychologist who sexually abuses patients or clients. But the thing is that the scope of what these professional regulators do is pretty expansive, and they can discipline their members for things that the members they say, including when the speech, the things that they're saying, are not in the direct practice of the profession. So an example of that would be a lawyer off duty baselessly whipping up contempt for a judge by lying about a judge. They're not actually practicing law when they're doing that, but it's connected to law, even if it's off duty and not directly practicing law. Another example would be a doctor who's leveraging their position as a physician to post online to say that vaccines are 5G microchips that will kill you. Like, that is an off-duty speech that is not in the practice of medicine, but it's pretty connected. Another example would be an accountant who runs like an online side business explaining to people who pay him how to commit fraud. Like, that is not engaging in the practice of accountancy, but it's pretty connected. So those are all things that are off-duty speech your regulator could discipline you for. But what about off-duty speech that is more lacking in a connection? So yelling at your neighbor about internet memes in his driveway, should that get you sanctioned as a lawyer? What about posting online about who is hot and who is not? Should that get you disciplined as a psychologist? Should arguing with your priest about the holy ritual of communion get you disciplined as a doctor? Or should a nurse be disciplined for protesting abortion? I contend that they should not be. These are all political, social, religious, or cultural expressions or viewpoints. They have nothing to do with the practice of any of these professions. But what we've seen is that in every single one of those examples I gave you, regulators investigate and in some cases sanction or caution that behavior. Perhaps most famously is the example of Jordan Peterson. He was disciplined for hot or not post, I guess you could call it, on X. And we intervened in that case to argue for broad protections for freedom of expression. Unfortunately, the discipline, the regulator actually said it's not discipline, but it is discipline in form. They did uphold that discipline. So I wrote a big report about this issue a few months ago for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. You can read it on the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's website for free. It's called The New Censorship, Regulatory Creep, Professional Regulators, and Growing Limits on Freedom of Expression. And following that report, the Alberta government announced their intention to review how professional regulators approach the regulation of off-duty speech and belief. And I have no way of knowing for sure, but I do think that the government likely read my report, because Premier Danielle Smith, in her video announcing this review, she cited two of the cases that I explained in my report. One was a case that we've worked on involving a nurse named Carolyn Strom, who was disciplined by her nursing regulator in Saskatchewan for posting on Facebook about the end-of-life care that her grandfather received and advocating for improvements in the healthcare system, something that should never have received discipline and was ultimately overturned at the Court of Appeal. And the other case that she mentioned was about a physician in Ontario who received a caution from the doctor's regulator for a letter that she wrote to the Greek Orthodox Archbishop and for an argument that she got into with her priest at her church, where the argument was over changes to the Holy Communion ritual during the pandemic. And this physician, her name's Dr. Polly Doulis, she expressed her religious and theological beliefs about communion. And there was actually very little reporting on that case. I actually Googled it, and I think I'm the only one who has talked about that case. So I think that the fact that Danielle Smith mentioned that case in particular indicates to me a good likelihood that they read my report. So I think because I wrote this report, I was invited to go to Edmonton and participate in a roundtable about freedom of speech and belief in the legal profession. And this meeting was specific to the legal profession. And interestingly, I actually say this in my report, the legal profession doesn't seem to have quite as much of an issue with regulating off-duty speech that's unrelated to the core function of the regulator. It doesn't have as big a problem as other profession. And I have a couple of theories about this. One, I think that the lawyers' regulatory body is made up of lawyers, unlike in other professions. And because it's made up of lawyers, they're already knowledgeable about the constitutional protections for free speech and how to conduct a balancing of a statutory purpose versus constitutional protection. So I think that they might be doing a better job of it because of that. And then also my other theory is that perhaps because lawyers are just more adversarial by nature of the profession, that as a result, they just are exposed to more disagreement generally, and so they're perhaps more comfortable with it. But I wanted to talk at this meeting about what we could learn from all of the professions more broadly, because the suppression of unpopular off-duty speech by regulators is a trend we're seeing rising across the jurisdictions, across professions, and I'm concerned it will eventually infect the legal profession as well. So the main case that I was concerned with that was specific to the legal profession and specific to Alberta involves former Alberta Minister of Health and former Alberta AG Tyler Shandro. So there were complaints made against Minister Shandro, who is a lawyer, to the Alberta Law Society as a result of 3 incidents when he was Minister of Health. So some background that is relevant is that there was this controversy around a potential conflict of interest that existed because Mr. Shandro's wife owned shares in a health insurance company called Vital Partners. Now, the ethics commissioner ultimately cleared Minister Shandro of any conflict, but in the interim, this became quite the kerfuffle on social media. And Shandro's wife was receiving some extremely threatening emails, like emails that included threats of violence, like very disturbing emails. Some of these are described in the written decision. One of Shandro's neighbors posted some internet meme about this Vital Partners controversy. And when Shandro was out, I mean, this guy lived a few houses down from him. Shandro saw the neighbor and they got into an argument about this meme at the end of the neighbor's driveway. And Shandro apparently was very emotional and he was telling the neighbor to delete the meme, and they were arguing. And this became a citation to the Law Society. Another incident was that someone had sent this nasty email to Shandro's wife, and this particular email was not threatening, but like it didn't threaten violence the way some of the other emails she'd received had. But since she had received a lot of other threats, I think Minister Shandro was like at a pretty elevated level and like didn't want people emailing his wife like angry, disturbing emails. So he replied to that email and he said that if correspondence like this wasn't addressed to him instead of his wife, he would get the authorities involved. So that led to a citation to the Law Society as well. And a third unrelated incident was that Shandro obtained the personal cell phone numbers of some doctors, and then he called them during non-working hours. I think it was something pandemic related. I don't really remember, but that became a citation as well. So none of these things have to do with the practice of law, but the complaints were made to the Law Society, to the regulator about these incidents. And this should have been dismissed out of hand. There is a screening process in Alberta, like there is in Ontario, where frivolous complaints are just dismissed. And the executive, and that should have happened. And then, if they proceed, the executive director of the Law Society can then dismiss a complaint summarily, and that should have happened too. But instead, this proceeded to an investigation. The executive director sent it to a discipline hearing, and all of the citations were made public. Of course, Shandro was found not guilty of misconduct for all three of these citations. This was off-duty speech. But I think it shows a willingness to weaponize the regulator because of the political position of that particular professional. This wouldn't have happened if it was not a politician having an argument over a meme in someone's driveway. This happened because of the political position, the political viewpoints that this individual held. And it never should have proceeded. Ultimately, the result was the right one, but the process is the punishment itself. Shandro was publicly humiliated by the disclosure of the citations. There was public evidence about an emotional incident from his personal life that was equally embarrassing. And Mr. Shandro had to pay to defend himself about these inappropriately brought citations. This happened not because of his role as a lawyer, but because of his political position and viewpoints. So I think there's some ways that we can think about this and how we could improve the system. And I propose a few of these in my paper, and I spoke about this at the roundtable. First, it's important to know that professionals retain the right to freedom of speech. They don't check their constitutional rights at the door when they enter a profession. Second, to have jurisdiction over off-duty speech, the regulator needs to show a nexus or a connection between the speech and the profession. And third, when the regulator wants to police off-duty speech, they need to weigh the constitutional protections against the statutory mandate of the regulator. And that's the mandate to regulate in the public interest as it relates to the profession, not the public interest like writ large. You know, it's in the public interest to be polite. No, you can't regulate as it relates to that. So I think that some helpful changes could be training regulators in those constitutional protections. That could help, especially when the regulatory body is not made up of lawyers who already understand these principles. And then finally, another change could be adjusting the standard of review by amending the statute. That could help as well. So that when constitutional rights are engaged, the legislature could legislate that the standard of review be correctness rather than reasonableness, and that higher standard would offer better protections for free speech of regulated professions. I also suggested that something could be done to improve the initial screening mechanism that allowed the complaints against Shandro to proceed. As I said, these frivolous claims are supposed to be thrown out, but something clearly failed in Shandro's case. Like, the claim should never have proceeded because it was so unconnected to the practice of law. And the fact that it did proceed shows there is some weakness there at the initial screening level. So that's what happened in Edmonton. Josh, had you heard of this Shandro case? I had heard of it, sort of some reporting on it, but reading the decision, it's so crazy to me.
Yeah, I heard about the Shandro case, and I think you're totally right about everything you said about that. And I'm so glad that, Alberta's interested in reining in some of these regulators, because the Jordan Peterson case, it just shows how absurd things can get and how it can be weaponized against basically every professional having any speech that's not politically correct, because that's what it really comes down to. But, these are hard things to deal with in terms of knowing where to draw the line, because on the one hand, it's good that the government has, left the regulation to the individuals who know best how their profession should run. Like, it's good not to have like a heavy hand of government in, how lawyers do their job or how doctors do their job. But at the same time, we're at the point where there definitely needs to be someone stepping in and making sure that there's enough of that nexus to the profession between the speech and what the profession does, and the public interest that they've been delegated to protect. And one thing I'd add is, I just think the level of harm that is the potential level of harm from the speech is something that we really need to pay attention to, because thinking back to the pandemic, you had medical regulators, putting out directives saying, well, you can't oppose lockdowns because that's not, that's going to harm the public. Well, but there's all kinds of other people on the other side saying actually no, lockdowns do more harm than good, and we don't have solid research on this. And we need to be able to have doctors out there saying, here's the research and here's why I think lockdowns are bad. Vaccines, the same thing. Like vaccines were not nearly as safe. I mean, generally, yes, they're safe and effective in general, but they're not nearly as safe as we were led to believe early in the pandemic. And yet, doctors who spoke out against that were, facing potential discipline. There's one doctor, she faced potential discipline for saying, if you think we need a vaccine to get out of this, you're not paying attention, or something along those lines. And how she could possibly face sanction for that is absurd. You gave the example of vaccines, including 5G microchips. That's something where there's just no evidence at all, and it's a conspiracy theory. So I could see punishing doctors who say that. They're really, potentially harming patients who would be better off with the vaccine than without it. But where to draw the line is always a little bit tricky. And at the end of the day, like, people in these professions need to step up and really understand that it's important to have very broad freedom of speech on this stuff, because lawyers can be wrong, doctors can be wrong, the entire profession can be wrong about something, and we'll only know that in the fullness of history. So I like this idea of giving them training on freedom of expression, the correctness standard, and making sure that nexus is there. So great recommendations. Glad you had a good time in Edmonton. I saw it was really cold, so.
No, it was great.
Oh,
I
was
like
it?
the cold though. I also like the cold in the snow.
Oh, well, I was happy. Yeah, I was happy here in the warmth. Let's move on to our bad legal takes. Do you want to go first, Christine?
Sure. So my bad legal take goes to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So we have seen a lot of efforts lately to ban or regulate or police so-called misinformation or disinformation. The federal government has a guidebook for public servants called Countering Disinformation. There were provisions of the Canadian Elections Act that put criminal penalties on people who spread, quote, misinformation during the election period. We had that struck down. We challenged it and had it struck down. We saw the US vice presidential candidate, Tim Walz, gave an interview saying that there is no guarantee to free speech on misinformation, especially around our democracy. And some academics argue for sanctions on misinformation. These ideas are explored in a report by a group called Evidence for Democracy, and it includes using the criminal law as well as anti-spam laws to counter, quote, misinformation. And I think the problem is what is misinformation and who you allow to define that. So enter Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau was at the G20 summit in Brazil. And while he was there, he spoke at another conference held by some anti-poverty group they're called Global Citizen. And he talked about the carbon tax. And he said that there's been pushback to the carbon tax policy. Actually, I bet calling it a carbon tax, he would say, is misinformation as well. And he said that the opposition to the carbon tax is fueled by propaganda and misinformation. And this is the problem. When you allow politicians to define what misinformation is, suddenly opposing a government policy makes you guilty of misinformation. This is why we cannot allow for the broad criminalization of speech, and why we challenged that provision in the Canada Elections Act against so-called misinformation, because ultimately it will be used to silence political dissent. So BLT this week to Justin Trudeau.
Great one, Christine. Let's take a quick break and then I'll give you mine. Okay, so my BLT goes to Out TV, which is a cable channel that you've probably never heard of, that for whatever reason the algorithm keeps recommending to me. Out TV is an LGBTQ focused channel that airs hits like Sugar Highs, a comedy that sadly I've actually been forced to watch. It's about three roommates who can't make the rent, so they would rather get high than work their menial jobs, and so they set out to find sugar daddies to pay their bills. That's a quote from OTV, Out TV. They also air a show called Go Go for the Gold, a game show featuring male go-go dancers doing various challenges, like go-go dancing in front of unwitting senior citizens who have no idea what the hell is going on.
What?
Yeah, I actually saw that one. It was a very awkward episode. Despite such illustrious programming, for some reason, the channel has faced a 60% decline in subscribers in recent years, from an estimated 1 million to around 400,000. And the reason for this, according to OTV representatives, is the quote, continued marginalization and discrimination against the channel, rather than the quality of the programming. So, as reported in Blacklocks, they've gone to the CRTC to demand that the CRTC force all cable subscribers to pay for this channel. And they want to force them to pay $1.44 per year, which would guarantee them $9 million in revenue per year. Whether or not the CRTC actually agrees to this demand, and they've rejected OTV's similar demands in the past, it should outrage Canadians that the government has given this bureaucracy the power to force them to pay for channels that they don't want in order to, well, we don't really know why. Anyway, what OTV is clearly doing here is just called rent seeking, and it's what pretty much every cable channel in Canada does, and they're forced to do that because that's the system as it's currently set up. Rent seeking is using lobbying to get streams of unearned revenue enforced by the state's monopoly on violence, where the free market has rejected what you're selling. And this is not unlike what the Online Streaming Act does. It basically allows people that make shows that people don't want to watch to continue getting paid regardless of that fact. And I think the whole system needs to be blown up, so people should be allowed to pick whatever channels they want. Those channels should be able to charge what they wanted. The CRTC shouldn't be picking winners and losers. So my bad legal take goes not to OTV, because who can blame them for trying, but to the laws in Canada that regulate broadcasting when there's really no need to do that in the 21st century. So that's the show. Thanks for listening. You can support our work by subscribing to the CCF's YouTube channel, by following us on X, or by visiting our website, theccf.ca, where you can sign up for our new and improved Freedom Update newsletter. The CCF is a nonpartisan legal charity funded by your donations, so please click that donate button on our website if you can. Thanks for listening.